today's show, we have two special guests who are going to be speaking about the Ethnic Studies Task Force. So welcome to our show. Please introduce yourselves.
Okay. My name is Boatamo Mosupyoe. I'm a professor of Pan-African Studies at California State University, Sacramento. I'm also the chair of Ethnic Studies, and currently I'm also doing a job in the Dean's Office on enrollment and space management.
Okay. Yeah. Enrollment. Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Kenneth Monteiro. I'm at San Francisco State, and I'm a professor and the Dean of College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State, and I've got to put in the pitch. It's the only college in the nation. We like that we're the first, but we don't like it that we're the only ones. We want some more colleges of ethnic studies around the nation.
Yes, great. And so today I think that's a great segue into the question that I want us to speak about, which is, so what is ethnic studies for the people who don't know, and also why is it important?
Ethnic studies is both a field of study, but it's also a way of changing how education and our actions relate to our community. So ethnic studies is the study of race and ethnicity when it is done from the perspective of people of color, asking our own questions, using our own methodologies, being able to ask questions that help our community if we get the answers to them, and also help us to achieve our aspirations. So it's intellectual, because it allows us to reinsert the intellectual traditions of a range of the world that aren't there now, and so we do the historical intellectual traditions that we have, but it also helps us to be really in the here and now and ask, how does education change our lives?
So it's both, it's a field of study, but also a method, if you will, and based on a marginalized perspective or the non-Western perspectives.
Yes.
When we look at the history of the university, you know, it wasn't created with that in mind. I think it's important to mention too, maybe since you teach at the College of Ethnic Studies, how it was created there.
Well, you know, ethnic studies came as a result of a struggle for people of color wanting to be represented in the curriculum. So that's an important point to make. And then it was preceded by struggles in different, Ken can speak better on that because I think he was part of that. It was preceded by the struggle, you know, a lot of struggles from San Francisco to Berkeley, and the Third World movement. So that's an important part that I wanted to say, that it is history and our stories our own way, not from a Eurocentric point of view.
Yeah, so it's important to highlight one of the unique things about this discipline, one of its histories, is that it's from the bottom up, if you will. It's from activism and social change that creates this discipline, which differentiates it from other disciplines on campus, you know, which often are top down, or we're already part of the project of the university. So I think that's something unique about ethnic studies.
Yeah, and also it's important to know that, you know, it studies race and ethnicity as a focal point, not just by the way, you know.
Right.
So that's a very important distinction to make.
You're right, because there are, as a result of the Third World Strike and ethnic studies, other disciplines then took on the task of perhaps offering that one class. And so I think it's important to mention that, although that's great, we actually concentrate specifically on, you know, the lens of race and ethnicity and power and intersectionality, right? Like that's how we approach the field versus something that you just add on.
Right.
You know.
And initially, if you look at education, it starts from the bottom up, and then when it institutionalizes itself, it creates the illusion that the top gave birth to the bottom. So basically, in a sense, seeing ethnic studies birthed is a way of actually seeing how education actually gets created. So when the Black Student Union began with its initial set of, I'm talking about San Francisco State, because it was bubbling up in many places, but the core of where it gets created is at San Francisco State, but it was bubbling up on other campuses. So the Black Student Union makes a demand for a Black Studies department, and then a range of ethnic organizations, and also white progressives and community members and staff and other faculty on campus and in the region, over a course of time, pushing the university, that's a struggle, demand a collective vision. The collective vision is Black studies La Raza Studies, which becomes Black Studies becomes Africana Studies. La Raza Studies becomes Latino Studies. Asian American Studies and American Indian Studies are demanded simultaneously and demanded to be put into one school. That's different. Some other places it were primarily Latino or primarily Chicano. You'd find a Chicano Studies, because that was what the demand was at the time. And the institution at a certain point in time resists and says no. But then at some point in time it becomes receptive and responsive and says yes. And that dynamic, that back and forth of struggle, responsiveness, struggle, responsiveness, goes throughout the whole 50-year history of ethnic studies.
Yeah, so you see the history and then the contemporary.
Yeah.
Right.
Sometimes it's very particular history that's localized. In some spaces, you may have different departments. In other
Yes.
places, it's under the rubric of ethnic studies. And I think it just speaks to this history that you're talking about right here.
Yeah, and then another important thing to point out, right, like the ethnic studies as we have presented in the Chancellor's Task Force primarily focuses on Native American, African American, Chicano, Asian American, right? That's the primary focus. But added to that, it is comparative, right? And it is also intersectional, and then that is why it allows you to study recent immigrants into the United States. It also allows you to go global. But it's important in our discussion, we said it is important to note that focus of ethnic studies, because the tendency is to water it down by bringing everything else. It's like everything, ethnic studies is everything else, but you know that when it was, since its inception, that is the focus, and we need to remember that.
It's important to remember that, too, the idea was to have a third world studies,
Yes.
and that it somehow in the compromise becomes ethnic studies.
Right.
And how sometimes post-multiculturalist movements of the 80s and 90s, it becomes like the hodgepodge of so many different things, and I think that that's why it's important to bring back its origin in relation to the now, and that there are different ways in which racializing processes work, and that there are other groups that weren't part of the traditional, four groups at the time that have emerged. And so it's just a way of seeing how the field evolves, but knowing that at the end of the day, it brings into question power relations, the globe, and then how it affects underrepresented communities.
And, and the power relationship is important for understanding ethnic studies, because it comes as a response to being disenfranchised to a certain degree, and as a empowering system of saying, and we will re-enfranchise ourselves. So the term ethnic studies is a euphemism because there's so many clusters that are ethnic. So to be Scottish in relationship to English, well, there's a struggle in Scotland and England that doesn't necessarily occur here.
Right.
Yeah, right.
When you get to the United States, that merges into whiteness, and whiteness becomes the supremacy here. In the British community, English is the supremacy, but here it's white supremacy. So what gets into ethnic studies are the ethnic groups that are partly defining their Americanness in relationship to the struggle of re-empowering themselves. So when someone says, well, why does something end up in one place or another place? The question is, are they doing it from that perspective? And again, we can be global, but ethnic studies says that you start from where the people are, that your university and your people are where you start. You can go into the diaspora. And so someone said, well, doesn't that exclude ethnic studies starting somewhere else in the world? Well, from this model, it says, no, start from where you are now. We have found the other College of Ethnic Studies, and it happens to be in China. Now, our stereotype might be, we're going to go there and it's the Chinese studying other people. They actually, for a different reason, have done it the same way. Their College of Ethnic Studies in Wuhan, China, studies ethnic Chinese. In other words, people who are Chinese or in China, because their identity may be to their ethnic group, who are struggling in relationship to the dominant Han Chinese.
Right.
So notice
The power relation.
So they call themselves a College of Ethnic Studies, not because they're studying the same people that we are. They're studying the marginalized where they are in order to help to liberate and strengthen and empower the people that. And they may look at Chinese-born folks in the diaspora.
Sure.
And they do actually, in fact. But they came to the conclusion differently halfway around the world. But that's ethnic studies rather than just the study of race and ethnicity as a distant issue. It's really allowing the people who own the identity to actually actualize how we're going to be studied and what's going to be done with us. Because, to put it less delicately, race and ethnicity were studied before ethnic studies, but they were studied in order to subjugate, to harm, to kill the marginalized people that we're talking about. So that's why it's not just the study of it.
Right.
It actually has to be that inner ownership where it's to the benefit of, and the part about struggle, sometimes people say, well, that's, what is academic studying struggle? When a historian does a lecture and starts with the date 1776 in the United States, in a traditional Western framework, well, they're making particular when white colonists declared their liberation from white colonizers. That's what they're doing. It's not just a day to have a musical. It's actually a talk of struggle. When you talk about the Civil War, and you talk about it from the perspective of wealthy white men in the North fighting with wealthy white men in the South, that's a struggle, theoretical, intellectual, and in terms of power. Now, underneath that Civil War, were also a set of people of African descent and people of native descent who were, if you will, the grasses upon which the elephants wanted to trample. But there's actually another set of civil wars going on there that we're now still playing out. The marginalized voices in those moments. So the Western canon does actually study the political struggles of people. It just studies the political struggles that create whiteness. When I say
Or reaffirm it.
Well, I actually
or
say
that
created as
with
well
the
because
perspective of the Western.
Do both, create and reaffirm.
Because before a few hundred years ago, of course, as you know, you also teach as well, before a few hundred years ago, they were Scottish, they were British,
sure.
they were Spanish, they were Irish. They weren't white. So part of that struggle is actually to create whiteness into the notion that nowadays people walk around thinking
It's so normalized.
right. And then then they laugh when you say, oh, they say, well, you know, I'm white, and white is, so well, where's Whiteland? Where did you come from? And then they get to laugh at themselves that it's not that white doesn't exist. White, like all of these, are social constructs where they were constructed out of the needs of a set of people, positive or negative. That's where they came from. It's not magical, and it didn't exist out in the world in some absolute world. It was constructed for a reason, and so white studies gets to control that, and people of color decided to take control of our own students' studies.
So then tell me how a little bit of the history of the Ethnic Studies Task Force, as we're talking about control. So how does the Ethnic Studies how does it emerge, and what are some of the goals that the task force has to challenge this idea of how, academia is controlled or knowledge production is controlled?
Yeah, we'll do it quite quickly.
Briefly.
Again,
And the task force document is online.
Exactly.
Yes,
So people can
And so-
Google and find and
Exactly.
look at the recommendations.
But it's a dynamic struggle, responsiveness, struggle, responsiveness. We have 23 campuses in the California State University system. 22 of them have some form of ethnic studies. Some may only have one faculty member, some may have a college. But we were going through another phase of where many of the campuses were feeling that either their own campus may have been backing away from them, or their campus was being attacked to get them to back away from them. And so there were things going on. So we got together about 5 years ago to find out what was common, what was unique. We got together again 4 years ago to determine how to communicate that to the chancellor. We get a new chancellor, and there's a struggle at Cal State University, Long Beach, right almost down the street from his office, where a president was attempting to devalue, move from a department to a program, the Africana Studies program there. The Africana Studies program resists. That's a struggle. At the same time, we're inviting this new chancellor to talk about ethnic studies. The new chancellor's coming in, has a certain responsiveness, but also has a struggle to handle. He handles the struggle at Long Beach because he actually steps in there. And when we come to meet with him, he is receptive to looking at the broader CSU and creates a task force. And by creating a task force, what the chancellor has to do is involve the board of trustees, the academic senates, the statewide student association, and engage the presidents to buy into this. And he creates a task force of over 20 members that had 4 presidents on it and several members of his staff, 9 members of the Ethnic Studies Council. So it's a fairly large group. It was intended to be quite powerful. We survey the campuses about what their challenges are, their needs, resources, and we find it's not our imagination. As student interest is increasing, resources are decreasing on most of the campuses. Some of it may have been intentional. I sit with most of the deans who actually oversee it, and they were surprised. They said, can't be, because, and they weren't looking at the difficulty of small numbers. If you lose 1 faculty member from a department of 4, you cut it by 25%. If you lose several faculty from a department of 50, so you might lose 4 out of the department of 50. Well, they lost twice as many faculty. Well, they didn't lose percentage-wise as much. So when you don't actually look at the data, but when you do, all of a sudden, everyone sort of sat back and said, well, there's a problem here. So for about 2 years, it takes a while for academics to study something, but it's important. We created collectively a document that reviews that, contextualizes it, does best practices suggestions, and produce the 10 recommendations.
Right, yeah. We look at the best practices, and we also look at the structural challenges that ethnic studies department and programs face all over. One other thing, just very quickly, that ethnic studies, they are structured differently in different universities. For instance, at Sac State, programmatically, Asian American studies, all the 4 ethnic groups, they form a department. We are not scattered. We are together. We are united. Yeah. So that makes us stronger than others. Yeah. So, and then studying the survey and the best practices and the challenges, structural challenges, then we came to the recommendations, which is what the chancellor wanted, right? To make people to understand what ethnic studies is, because everybody thinks that they can define what ethnic studies is, right? They think they can teach ethnic studies, right? But what we did was to, put in a document for people to acknowledge and, and respect the vitality of the discipline. And then the other thing that the chancellor wanted us to come up with recommendations that could be, and then we did come with recommendations that can be short-term or long-term, implemented in the short-term and in the long-term.
So it sounds like the document emerged simultaneously with the struggle that was taking place, and that it's going to help advance ethnic studies across the CSUs, and that there are recommendations and a document and research that was done and conducted, which I think right now is exciting because it's an actual document, and not only that, but conversations that are happening that is giving attention to the field, which hasn't really been given to in this kind of systemic, serious way. So I think that's a really exciting, an exciting place to be at right now. And so the document can really help us to think of how we can move forward. And I think it's important to mention too that at the CSUs, the student body is overwhelmingly underrepresented backgrounds. Many of them are first generation college or of marginalized backgrounds. So I think that's why it's so important, particularly to highlight the CSUs, that ethnic studies, which focuses on these power relations, which often empower a lot of these underrepresented students, we are the campus that is dealing with the most a significant portion of the population. So I think that's important to mention there because that's where the contradiction becomes more apparent.
Yes.
Right? If we're dealing with majority students of color, majority first generation, then why is it that the field that seriously, calls attention to this population group is underdeveloped? So I think this is one of the contradictions that is emerging, and also how hopefully we can move forward with a document like this.
Yeah, hopefully the presidents will take the document seriously. And I must say, at Sac State, we have a president who's really extremely supportive. He's really extremely supportive. I can't speak of other campuses, Uh, we have made so many recommendations, including representation in Title V, where, other departments are very territorial. Yeah. But in our campus, we have not been included yet in that, but I'm not going to say that we are deliberately excluded. So, and then in terms of hiring, we've had one hire for 3 successive years each year, but we still need more. And then in terms of, the program directors used to get release time, but after the recession we didn't. So that's one thing too that we need to address. But overall, at Sac State, I think we have really been conscious in trying to meet the 10 recommendations.
That's great to hear. How about at San Francisco State? How has the response been?
It's actually good that you have the 3 campuses represented. At Stanislaus, you have the smaller side where you had started at 4, gone down to actually momentarily none actually, because 2 were going out, at 2 came in, and 2 came in, and now you're going to double back up to 4 again. So that's like about a half dozen of the campuses. Sacramento State is sort of the middle group. San Francisco State is different.
The large, giant group.
So we both have different challenges and different opportunities simultaneously. So you may have read earlier that we had a financial challenge between the university level budgeting and the college level budgeting. But we're a college of almost 80 faculty totally, the lecturers and the tenure track faculty, actually over 80 faculty, and about 8,000 students are coming through our doors. So the challenge, the newspapers couldn't quite capture that. Are you going to die or are you going to live? And we're like, that's not our question at San Francisco State. We have a budgetary challenge, and our budgetary challenge to the provost and the president actually produced a movement towards transparent budget planning that the president and the provost have taken on. So we've put this discussion inside of that overall budget transparency discussion that's helping the whole university. This was the intent of ethnic studies, was to challenge university and to make things better. So we haven't quite solved the original question that we had with the budget, but we're in the process of how we're going to handle it. On the other hand, the budget transparency, which is helping all the colleges, is helping us on other ends. So for example, without knowing the details, you don't have to go into that, but some of our GE courses offerings come out of something called an augment, a general framework. In the last couple of years, we've gotten more monies for augments. So we were able to demonstrate that we had more need because when we got the money, we were running about 6,000 students. Pushing us up to an 8,000 student demand could have crushed us if we really didn't have the demand. And we immediately went from 6 to 8,000, showing that there were students that were trying to get in. So we're a little bit more complex. It's sort of like if you've been married for 50 years, which we almost have been, you'll see something happen. If the newlyweds are like, are you going to break up? And we're like, are you kidding me? We got house kids and whatever. On the other hand, is it a big problem? Yes, and we deal with it. So you can see the sort of the evolution of this institutionally, and so the struggle responsiveness is still an issue. So we have administrators who philosophically would like to be supportive and put in the position where they still don't necessarily know us as an institution, that we are actually a legitimate institution. And sometimes the conflict is that we're actually moving the institution in the direction it wants to go. But like individuals, even, I don't want to get up tomorrow morning to do exercise. I need sometimes to be nudged. And that dynamic, which oftentimes people fear, the notion of struggle that's feared by individuals and institutions, is the healthy process. So we're now modeling how the institution involves. So I'm going to give you 2 pieces of data. You're getting a preview on one of them. So it'll be more official in about a month. But we've had a study of ethnic studies courses that we and the San Francisco Unified School Districts put together in the high school, that's demonstrated that just one ethnic studies course moved high school students a grade and a half. They vary in ethnicity, they vary in gender, a grade and a half. And for black and brown boys, helped them in science and math, and the course was in the social sciences. We're replicating that kind of a study on campus for graduation rates. So don't tell anybody on this camera. But the early data don't only say that those who major in ethnic studies are more likely to graduate. They say that if you've taken just one of our classes, you're greatly more likely to graduate in a normal frame.
And I think this is a lot of data for those of us who teach ethnic studies know this. Maybe either because we were impacted with the course or see how our students are. I think what I find on this campus, for example, is maybe that senior who happened to take a class, they stumbled upon it, and they're like, why didn't I know about this? And I think this is why the task force, the first recommendation of the idea of creating an ethnic studies requirement could change that, because then it doesn't become by chance or fluke, but actually that it's part of your general education requirements that could actually help, as you mentioned, the administration and the university do their job, which is you want students to graduate, in 4 or 5 years, just implement more ethnic studies classes, because the majority of your students are the ones that are going to really benefit from these kinds of courses. So I think the more research and data that we have to make these claims, the stronger then it is for us to develop it in advanced ethnic studies. But I think a lot of us already know, right, that these classes are very powerful and can really help change people's lives.
Absolutely.
At Sac State, we have programs like Cooper Woodson College Enhancement Program, which is run by Ethnic Studies faculty, and it has over 90% graduation and retention rate, and it houses African American students. And then we have like programs like Camp for Latina. The most of the professors there are ethnic studies. So, it's important to recognize the service that ethnic studies faculty provide to universities beyond the normal advising and teaching. So
and I think when we treat the discipline more seriously and actually have the research and data, this is how we can start to shift the labor that we do that often doesn't get recognized. And yes,
it's a win-win-win. We're restoring we're restoring intellectual traditions to the American university that have been excluded from the university but existed for millennia. In fact, they predate most of the cultural contributions that are taught in the university right now. And so you've got Americans who don't know the world, and they don't know the world that is actually right here in San Francisco, or in Stanislaus, or in Sacramento. They're looking at the descendants of the people who created cultures and technologies that, in fact, their own cultures sit on. So the British were not the Italians were not the Greeks, and the Greeks were not the Egyptians. Without the Egyptians, you don't get the Greek culture. Without the Greek culture, you don't get the Roman culture. If you don't get without the Roman culture, you do not get the advances and the universities of Britain, which means you don't get the ones in the United States, the English-speaking portion that we're talking about. So the interconnectedness of restoring a place, a university that really is more university, where you're getting the intellectual traditions back together, just academically is a better place. And then we find out it's good for people.
And society.
And for society.
Beyond the university.
And then people are wondering about innovation. Well, the more knowledge you have and the more people you have invested in it, and the more willing they are to ask important questions about the problems of today. Innovation is about applying your knowledge and your wisdom to solving the problems in front of you. And with that corpus of knowledge, with the things that we've got coming for us to address, you've got a more powerful system. That doesn't mean that people don't resist change. I resist going to exercise. I'm saying this, so I go. I resist, but it would be a good thing. But resistance attracts resistance. So when an institution resists change, those it's supposed to serve resist it. Now, the institution only sees the resistance on one side. And so depending on which camera is looking at it, they describe it as this aggressed to that aggressed. just take the struggle and know that it's going to go back and forth and keep pointing it forward. And that's what ethnic studies is about. It's not only about doing its own thing, if you will. It is about engaging the university, engaging its community, engaging the society and the world to ask the questions of how do you produce knowledge to empower, liberate, and create a more socially just society, not to do it to oppress, not to do it to exploit, not to do it to harm. And that, interesting enough, as good and wonderful and virtuous a purpose as it is, feels alien in the university that's in, because that university, and it's hard for it to admit to itself, was created to ensure that this didn't happen. The universities in the United States were created to ensure that the wealthiest and the whitest and the malest and the Protestantish, actually, of us succeeded and the rest didn't. Now, we don't want to say that because it feels bad. It just, who wants to say that, you know, I was actually created to be a mess? Well, that's true about people, too. Sometimes, you know, you come into a circumstance, and your circumstance puts you in a situation where you were actually trained not to be very virtuous. You actually resist changing to the thing you want to be, which is virtuous. And when you do, the funny thing is, of course, it's amazing and it's sustaining. So universities, as they take it on and they embrace it, resist it, but as they see that they are actually transforming into what they really in their hearts aspire to be, a place where knowledge is used to advance the quality of human life and human dignity. And they get out of the notion of, ooh, I feel uncomfortable today, but they get into what the bigger picture is. Then I think you get the leaps that happen.
Yeah, I also hope that from the document, you know, I'm not going to be naive and say that it will eliminate the struggle. You know, the struggle continues, a luta continua. But I'm hoping that people will have an understanding of ethnic studies and help in its advancement. And then Ken was talking about, you know, people feeling discomfort. You know, I hope that we will reach a place where they will be comfortable in their discomfort.
That's it.
And yeah,
I know, I love it.
and help us advance ethnic studies. You know, before even we finish, I want to say that thank you for inviting us here and for the great job that you are doing in advancing ethnic studies here. And then I hope that they continue to support you.
And thank you both for being here. It was a great conversation, and certainly not the end of the conversation. And we will continue to advance ethnic studies in the best way that we can in our respective spaces. And thank you for the work that you're doing in the task force.
From what we saw about the enthusiasm of your students, you're doing the right stuff.
Great, thank you. So that's it for the episode on Woke in the CV. Please check out other upcoming episodes.